Hi, my name is Georgia Devonish and I'll be presenting my research project for AFNR5905. The title of the project is The Economic Viability of Native Grain Production in the Boulogne Shire of Southwest Queensland. I'm the principal researcher and I was assisted by my project supervisor, Dr. Shauna Phillips. In Australia, acknowledgement and resurgence of Indigenous Australian culture and enterprise, focus on nutrition and regenerative agriculture have all contributed to a growing interest in the commercialisation of Australia's native grains industry. The study tested the hypothesis that native grain production is an economically viable farm activity in a dryland mixed farming enterprise in the Boulogne Shire of Southwest Queensland, due to the value of the grain and the ability to vertically stack outputs. The aims of the project were to reduce the economic uncertainty around the production of native grains in order to encourage greater adoption at the farm level, and to assist with knowledge sharing and the provision of foundations for development and extension efforts for native grain production. In terms of how the study was conducted, this experiment was based on production economics and utilised gross margin data to create a representative farm model. Published data on the economics of native grain production is presently limited, and so key data sources included native grain producer Dunkerry South Seeds and industry expert Mr. Jacob Birch. Linear programming was then used to evaluate the economic viability of native grain production in the representative whole farm model. The advantage of this mathematical programming technique is the ability to integrate biological, physical, and financial parameters to optimize a whole farm system. Beyond the base scenario, a series of modelling variation experiments were undertaken to analyse the impacts of changes to constraints, costs, and resource availability on the optimal farm plan. Sensitivity analysis was then conducted to observe how total farm gross margin changed as key assumptions in the model were varied. The representative farm model was a 3,000 hectare dry land mixed farming enterprise located in the Boulogne Shire of Southwest Queensland. The farm activities are described in Table 1 to the left. Table 2 highlights that there were 3 marketing activities that were modelled for the native grain crop. These include the revegetation market, food and beverage direct, and the local mill. The local mill is a hypothetical case which was included to explore whether the development of local supply chain infrastructure owned and operated by the local Indigenous community could improve upstream economic viability of native grain production. The farm activities in the model were constrained by labour availability and feed production. Table 2 also highlights that the farm activities were constrained by maximum and minimum limits on production and sales volume. Moving on to the results of the study. The linear programming technique returned an optimal farm plan for the representative farm, as summarised here in Table 3. The total farm gross margin was $1,092,263. The native grain crop represented 20% of the optimal farm plan on an area basis and 40% of total farm gross margin. In the model, the area planted to the native grain crop was constrained by market capacity of 35,000 tonnes. You can see here that all other farm activities were included in the optimal farm plan. 1,109 hectares was planted to the crop rotation and 2,552 head of sheep were grazed across the native grain crop, existing pasture and a fodder oats crop. Looking at feed production on the farm, 101,939 livestock months of feed were produced. The native grain crop provided 27% of total feed availability and contributed proportionally more feed during spring and summer. Figure 1 highlights both the feed utilisation and the feed transfer activities between seasons. You can also see the important contribution the fodder oats crop made to feed production in winter. Analysis of labour resource requirements was also undertaken. Required labour was highest in spring with 1.6 full-time equivalent labourers required. This was due to lambing and weaning in the sheep operation and the harvest of the crop rotation in November. Labour requirements were highly seasonal for the native grain crop. 80% of farm labour usage occurred in winter due to the timing of slashing and harvest. To analyse the cost profile of the cropping activities, the production cycle was divided into 4 phases, including establishment, crop management, harvest, and post-harvest. The timing of costs were found to be different between the native grain crop and the crop rotation. The analysis showed that the conventional crops had higher costs during establishment and crop management phases, while the native grain crop had high costs during the harvest and the post-harvest phases. The table on this slide shows the results from the model variation experiment highlighted earlier. The 4 key results to note include, firstly, that the exclusion of the local mill market option reduced area planted to the native grain crop from 20% to 16% of total area. Secondly, due to the exclusion of feed production from the native grain crop, total farm gross margin reduced by 13% and the head of sheep produced on the property declined by 692. Thirdly, the no native grain crop farm model reduced total farm gross margin by 57% compared to the base model scenario. Finally, the inclusion of the irrigated crop rotation removed the native grain crop entirely from the model and increased total farm gross margin to 8.6 million. The results of the sensitivity analysis are showcased here. This top figure focused specifically on the native grain crop and showed that total farm gross margin was most sensitive to changes in price compared to yield and market capacity. The bottom figure showed total farm gross margin was most sensitive to decreases in the price assumption of the native grain crop compared to the decreases in crop rotation and the sheep market price assumptions. The final figure from the results shows the floor price at which the inclusion of the native grain crop in the optimal farm plan changes. For all marketing options, production fell out of the model at prices below $10 per kilogram. The revegetation market, however, could accept a price of $8 per kilogram based on the lower cost profile. The results of the linear programming model show that native grain production has the potential to be an economically viable farm activity in a dry land mixed farming enterprise. The model variation experiment showed that without the native grain crop, the total farm gross margin of the optimal farm plan fell by 36%. Further to this, the model variation experiment illustrated that the native grain crop was not competitive against an irrigated crop rotation, emphasising the focus of native grain production in dry land farming systems. The potential for the introduction of native grain to a farm plan was assessed to be highest for mixed farming enterprises. A key contributing factor was the ability for the native grain crop to contribute to livestock feed production. The addition of feed production from the native grain crop produced a higher total farm gross margin and allowed 37% more sheep to be produced in the optimal farm plan. The assumed unit prices for each of the native grain markets was found to underpin the economic viability of native grain production. This can be seen in both the sensitivity analysis and the floor price analysis for each of the marketing options. The total farm gross margin result appears to rely on native grain being a niche industry with low supply to support prices. It's worth noting this because as the industry evolves, an increase in grain supply and improved post-harvest technology may be compensated with lower prices, subsequently impacting the gross margin of production. Moving on to market capacity. This was also an important consideration for producers of native grain. The exclusion of the local mill market option in the variation experiment showed that further capacity increased total farm gross margin. From a producer perspective, development of local supply chain infrastructure could improve the viability of native grain production. Increased capacity could assist with smoothing interannual instability in market demand and reduce reliance on the relationships between growers and buyers to facilitate purchasing pathways. In terms of farm management, high labour requirements during the harvest and post-harvest phases is reflective of the infancy of the native grains industry, with significant gaps in technology and technical knowledge relating to harvest and seed cleaning equipment. While it was found that labour requirements were within the bounds of what is typical for a farm this size within the Boulogne Shire, a high level of management sophistication is required to produce native grain crops. The cost and yield assumptions within the model were predicated on the manager having sufficient biological, agronomical, and technical knowledge of producing grain from curly Mitchell grass. This is evident in the establishment phase, in the assumption that the native grain crop planting had a sufficient strike rate of over 80%. However, low seed strike rates have been highlighted by multiple sources as a key issue for the industry. Another commonly identified challenge with the establishment of a native grain crop is the opportunity cost of not producing an income from that land for 12 months. An emerging management technique which was modelled was the planting of the native grain crop into a cover crop like barley. This allows the cover crop to absorb the opportunity cost of no income from that land for the first year as the native grain crop establishes itself, and takes the burden of some of the establishment costs, including fallow management. So in conclusion, the creation and analysis of the representative farm model provided insights into the potential of a native grain crop to be introduced into a dryland mixed farming enterprise in the Boulogne Shire by identifying key value drivers as well as the challenges. Information like this on the economic viability of native grain production is required to develop a profitable industry and create sustainable economic outcomes for regional communities like the Boulogne Shire. Future work should include understanding unpriced benefits, carbon farming opportunities, and the performance of native grain crops in varying climate scenarios.